Hello and welcome to the Linguistics Podcast. My name is Chris, and this is episode 2 where we'll be focusing on phonetics. Phonetics is a subfield of linguistics that is concerned with the sounds of language. Now, I know in the last episode I mentioned that all of linguistics is concerned with linguistic sound, but really phonetics specifically is concerned with sound segments. And we'll go over what those are in just a second. Once again, I'd like to reiterate that when I say linguistics is concerned only with sound, I'm not excluding sign languages. Sign languages are studied heavily, in fact, in linguistics, and most of the elements that we'll be talking about in the sounds of language have similar structures in sign languages, okay? So it's not to say that sign languages are excluded here. But by and large, most human languages are predominantly spoken, and thus most of linguistics is concerned with that. Now, phonetics, like I said, is concerned primarily with sound segments. So let's talk about what a sound segment is. A sound segment is any tiny bit of sound which can be differentiated from another sound. So if we imagine the word dad, that word dad has how many different sounds in it? Well, if you really think about it, without thinking about the spelling, by the way, and I'll mention why that might throw you off in a little bit. But if you just think about the sound of the word dad, dad. Now, if you say it slower, this can be simpler. Dad. How many sounds do we have there? Well, as it turns out, we have two sounds. Okay, we have two sounds. We have d and a. And then, of course, the third sound in the word is the first sound repeated over again. Now, what differentiates d from a? How can we tell the difference? Well, as it turns out, our brains are very, very good at picking out subtle differences between sounds. So much so that sounds that are, in fact, very similar, things like b and p, can be differentiated. Most of you at home, if this microphone setup is sufficient, will have heard what you would associate with a letter B and what you would associate with a letter P, one after the other. B, p. Very, very similar sounds, very, very close to each other, and yet we can distinguish them. That's of great interest, of course, to people who are interested in phonetics. But let's talk a little bit more about what kinds of segments we have. So you've already heard two different kinds of segments. You've heard d and you've heard a. Let's talk about the a first. So what is the a? A is a vowel. It's one of many English vowels. English has actually far more than the 5 or 6 vowels you were probably told it has in school. In fact, English probably has more than 10 vowels when you get down to all of the intricacies of the English vocalic system. But what's important about vowels is that they are a specific type of segment which can be examined in terms of their articulation. What is articulation? Well, this concept here, the concept of articulation, it forms the basis for phonetics as a whole. And what articulation means is how are the sounds produced? Okay? So, if you think about when you're speaking, when you say the word dad, you can say it as many times as you want, and every single time you're going to put your mouth into the same position when you say the word dad. And when you say the sound duh, your mouth will always do the same thing. Your tongue will always do the same thing. And why is that? Well, that's because your mind, your brain, knows how to articulate sounds. It knows how to move the muscles of your mouth to produce certain sound patterns, which in turn are sound segments, or understood by listeners as sound segments. And if you look at how the sounds are articulated, in other words, what parts of the mouth are used, it turns out we can organize segments quite well by looking at that. So let's start looking at different ways of articulating sound, and then it should clear up the whole idea of sound segment a little bit more. We'll start with a voiced and voiceless distinction. Now, most all of us know that the vocal cords, or the vocal folds as they're sometimes called, are used all the time for voicing. So when you're not whispering, when you're actually speaking, as I'm doing right now, I'm using my vocal cords to produce a sort of vibration which is heard as my voice. Now, some sounds can be differentiated by whether or not I'm using my vocal cords when I produce them or not. Okay? So what does this mean? Well, think about the two sounds d and t. These would be represented by D and T in the International Phonetic Alphabet. Now listen closer to when I produce these sounds, and I'm going to be very careful to produce a sort of prototypical version of each one of these sounds so as to be as clear as possible. So here we go. D, t. Okay, let me do it again. D, t. So the first one is the voiced sound, and that's represented by the letter D in International Phonetic Alphabet, which for short is called the IPA. And the second sound, represented by T in the IPA, is simply T. No voicing. Now, as this podcast, of course, is done in English, most all of you out there will be most familiar with English sounds. And in English, we have a lot of voiced and devoiced pairings. Okay, we have pairs of segments which are separated only by one feature, and that feature is voicing. Now, coincidentally, this is what's referred to as a minimal pair. A minimal pair is two sound segments which are separated only through the use of one feature. And in these cases, it is voicing. So I've already said that D and T in IPA are separated by voice. Let me say those again. D, T. You also have B and P in IPA, which are separated only by voicing. B, P. And we also have G and K in IPA, which are separated only by voicing. G, K. Now, what else is unique about those sounds? Well, as it turns out, it's not just enough to look at voicing to figure out how these sounds are split up. So consider the sound G versus the sound D. So let me say those again. And again, I'm talking just about their IPA representations here. So here's the sound G, G, versus the sound D, D. Now let me say them in succession. D, G, D, G. It may be a little bit difficult to hear through the microphone, but all of you out there, if you're speakers of English, can differentiate these two quite readily. In fact, they form the only difference between the words dot and got. And there's no voicing difference between the first segment of either one of those words, if you think about it. So you have d, g, both are voiced sounds. So what else is it that's allowing you to differentiate the sounds? Well, it's called the place of articulation. Okay? The place of articulation is where in the mouth the sound is being made. So it's not whether or not you are using your vocal cords or your vocal folds, but it's where you're making the sound. So if you say g, and this is g as in got, right here, the G sound. If you say g, you'll feel in the back of your mouth you're making some kind of contact back there. G, g. And that's because g is what's known as a velar sound. The velum is a little flap of skin at the rear of your mouth, and you are closing it and quickly opening it to produce the sound g. And that's the contact that you feel all the way back in your mouth. That's the only way to produce that particular sound. G is a velar sound, so you must use your velum. Now, if you say the word d, or the segment d, as in dot, you find that your tongue is tapping the ridge behind your teeth. Now, try it again. D, d. Your tongue taps the ridge behind your teeth. That's known as the alveolar ridge. And that's why we call d an alveolar sound, because your tongue makes contact with the alveolar ridge to produce the sound. Okay? So far we have two ways of distinguishing sound segments. We can distinguish them by where they are articulated, and we can distinguish them by whether or not they're voiced. Okay? Now, there is another criterion which can make it easy to distinguish sounds, and that is manner of articulation. So far, what we just talked about was place of articulation, that is where in the mouth you make the sounds. but manner of articulation can be very important as well. Now, what do I mean by this? We can figure that out if we think of two different sounds now. So let's think about the T sound, T in IPA, in other words, T, versus the S sound, S in IPA, S. Now let me make these again. T, S, T, S. What is in common with these sounds? Well, as it turns out, two things are in common between these sounds. Neither one of them is voiced. I don't use my vocal cords to produce either one. And more importantly, the place of articulation is the same. So if you feel your tongue as you produce both of these sounds, t, s, t, s, you'll notice that on the t, you have contact with the alveolar ridge. T is the devoiced alveolar sound. But in the s, you'll notice that your tongue goes up near the alveolar ridge. It doesn't quite touch it, but the alveolar ridge is still the closest thing in the mouth it's near. And thus we say that s is also an alveolar sound. So then what is the difference between t and s? Well, as it turns out, the difference is the manner of articulation. T is what is known as a stop sound, and s is what's known as a sibilant sound. Sibilant sounds are all S-like sounds. They involve air rushing past the tongue and other parts of the oral cavity, whereas a stop sound is a temporary stoppage of air and afterwards a release, and what you actually hear is the release of the sound. So if I don't release my t, I end up with t. And in fact, that little t right there was because I did release it a little tiny bit, because without doing that, you wouldn't know I was making a sound, especially not through a microphone. So you hear the release on a stop, you hear the air flowing past on a sibilant, similar to a fricative. A fricative, same root as friction. Fricatives include sounds like f, the F sound, where you're blowing air past a semi-closed cavity, and so on and so forth. There are different manners of articulation, just as there are different places of articulation. Let me go over a couple more. Affricates are a mixture of a fricative and a stop, so these are sounds like ch. Notice the difference between sh, which is a fricative, and ch, which is an affricate. It's a little bit more stoppy than a fricative. Right? We also have things like nasals. Nasals are sounds that use your nasal cavity. So these are things like nasal sounds. The last sound in the word lemon, n, that's a nasal. That's a nasal, alveolar nasal in that case. So you'll notice that with this three-part distinction, we can essentially differentiate sound segments not only in English but in any human language, really. These should be sufficient to differentiate any sound that we come across, even sounds that don't exist in one language or another. So to explain that, let me go back into vowels for a second. Vowels are differentiated just as consonants are, except that the vowel is a manner of articulation. So all vowels are articulated in the same way. They're sort of open sounds. They involve a lot of reverberation in the oral cavity, sometimes in the nasal cavity, depending on the vowel. This is what's crucial about vowels, is they share the same manner of articulation. They will vary in terms of place, however, and thus that leads to what's called a vowel chart, which is used in phonetics, where vowels are split up by front, back, mid, high, low, things like this, and they're laid out on a chart. And this is basically just the location of the reverberation chamber, either in the oral cavity or whether or not the nasal cavity is open or not for some vowels. So something like E, that's a high front vowel. Something like oo is a high back vowel. Something like ah is a low front. Something like aw is a low back vowel. And something like is right in the middle. In fact, the sound is a special sound. It's known as the schwa. And the schwa basically is a sound which is it does not include any overt features really. If you relax your mouth and you say you see how easy it is just to say that sound. Now that's why the schwa is kind of special. You don't have to do anything really to make it. Anyway, so yeah, so segments are split up by what? They're split up by voicing. They're split up by place of articulation, manner of articulation, and all vowels share the same manner of articulation. Now, with that being said, now you sort of know the concept behind a sound segment. But why is this important? Well, as it turns out, languages will vary based on the segments that they use. So if you've ever tried to learn a foreign language and you think that you're saying something correctly, and somebody says, "Oh, your pronunciation is it's not on. Something's wrong." I hear your accent. Maybe they might say. That is due to the fact that your language that you already know probably doesn't have the sound segment that you're trying to produce, and that makes it more difficult for you. So, for example, it's become popular in internet speak to use the word über. Über. Now, this is U umlaut B-E-R. And I imagine most people in America who know this term probably just say Uber. Uber. Now, that U at the beginning is just a regular English-like U vowel. Okay? But as it turns out, in German, the umlaut denotes a different sound. It's not U, but it's Ü. Ü. Okay? It's a different sound segment. Now, English does not have that sound segment. So if you say the word über to an English speaker who does not know any better, they will most likely reproduce it as Uber with just saying the English sound and not the German sound. This is why phonetics is interesting, and this is where it gets important. Because if you want to really speak another language, and you want to be able to reproduce the sounds correctly, you need to understand the concept of the sound segment. So that's phonetics for you in a very, very small nutshell. Obviously, it gets more complex than this. Segment inventories, that is to say, the number of sounds that a single language uses can get extremely large, and the differentiations between sound segments can get extremely small. And this is still actively studied in linguistics. Some current issues, especially in cognitive linguistics, are things like categorical perception, and that is how the human brain gets so good at discerning things like b, p differences when they're so very close to each other. There are different aspects also of sound, which I haven't covered here because I think it would take a little bit too long. Things like aspiration, that's the puff of air in English when you pronounce certain sounds at the beginning of a word, namely voiceless stops. So we don't say pot in English, we say pot with a puff of air. That's called aspiration. And if I get enough questions about it, I will go over that in a future episode, or maybe I'll just go over it in the phonology episode. If you do find that you are interested in phonetics, there's a sort of quintessential text, and generally I won't suggest textbooks as sources to go to because I think they're generally sort of dry. But this particular textbook is very short. It's less than 300 pages, and it's well written, and it's not too expensive, and so I recommend it. It's called A Course in Phonetics by Peter Ladefoged. And he is he's extremely famous in linguistics for the work that he did with phonetics, and it's really just a sort of quintessential piece, and it's filled with not only descriptions but diagrams of places of articulation, all about manners of articulation. Gets into really specific stuff near the end. So if you do find that you're very interested in phonetics, this would be the book to get. Now, on the next episode, we're going to talk about phonology, which takes this idea of sound segments and segment inventories. By the way, a segment inventory is the set of segments that a language uses. Phonology takes these concepts and sort of runs with them. And if you're at all interested in learning how to make your accent better, or learning how to pronounce foreign words better, you'll want to listen in to the next episode, which will be on phonology, because phonology really is the key to figuring out not only the segments, but how they go together. And we'll also talk about a very interesting feature of phonology known as co-articulation. Co-articulation. We'll go over that next time, exactly what that means and how it lets you understand things like "did you go yesterday" as "did you go yesterday." Very interesting stuff there. So, I'd like to thank you for listening to this. Once again, my name is Chris. This has been the Linguistics Podcast, Episode 2 on phonetics. If you have any questions, concerns, drop me a line on Twitter. I'm at @linguistchris. I'm also on WordPress at http://linguistchris.wordpress.com. Thanks again.